Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon panel. Overcapacities in China, a threat to the industrial base in the West? Question mark. My name is Julia Ganter. I'm a Program Director International Affairs at the German foundation Körber Stiftung. And I'm very delighted to moderate today's very timely panel, as I find. If you just look at the more recent developments and the Western reaction to what the West perceives as Chinese overcapacity, we can see quite some developments over the past 6 weeks. To give you a brief overview, May 14th, the US announces extensive tariff hikes on China for key industries. June 12th, the EU announces additional tariffs on Chinese EVs. Last Friday, the German minister, Robert Habeck, travels to Beijing to talk about, amongst others, fair and level playing fields. And over the weekend, the Chinese Minister for Commerce, Wang Wentao, and the European Commissioner for Trade, Valdis Dombrovskis, agreed to launch consultation on tariffs. However, the EU tariffs will come into force provisionally next week. So that's why I meant it's a very timely topic to discuss it today. Over the next 75 minutes, we will look at these latest events that I just mentioned, but we will also take a step back and talk about more fundamental questions related to overcapacity and how China sees these issues, and we also want to talk about the way forward. And to do this, gladly, I have support of a stellar panel. Please welcome with me Mikko Huotari. He is the Executive Director of the Mercator Institute for China Studies, MERICS. Some people say the leading think tank on China in Europe. Moritz, Schularick, President of the Kiel-Institute for the World Economy and also a Professor of Economics at Sciences Po in Paris. Wolfgang Niedermark, member of the Executive Board of the Federation of German Industries. And as you can see, we have one empty seat, and we hope very much that within the next 10 minutes or so, Franziska Brantner, who is Parliamentary State Secretary at the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action, and also a parliamentarian for the Green Party, will join us and share her official government perspective on the issue. This already leads me to one housekeeping remark before we start. As Franziska Brantner also needs to leave a little bit earlier, we will discuss for around 30 minutes, that's at least the plan, and then have a first round of questions from you here in the room, but also from our live stream audience. So if you're listening to this via the live stream, you can ask your question, I think, using the feedback tool on the website. And my co-moderator will read it out for you. So we can also include your questions joining from wherever via live stream. After this first block of questions, we will continue our conversation and have then a second block for questions towards the end. So in any case, have your questions ready. Now, I'm aware that it has been a very long conference day for most of you, and it has been a very hot day for everyone, that's for sure. So I wanted to shake things up a little bit, and instead of starting with some long introductory remarks from everyone, I would like to ask you a question and would like to have a quick answer to it. What I want to know from each of you is, on a scale from 1 to 10, how big is the threat that China's overcapacity currently poses to the industrial base in Germany? So I'm getting a little bit more concrete than this title of the event. And your scale is from 1, no threat at all, to 10, a massive threat. Mikko, why don't we start with you? And please, your mic.
Excellent. Thank you, Julia, and also good afternoon to everyone. Fantastic to be able to host this panel together, also with the other organizers. To be very short and brief on this, I think if you speak about the current threat to the German industrial base and not the European or not the Western industrial base, it's probably still relatively limited at this very moment. But if you open up the time horizon a little bit towards the future, next 2, 5, 10 years, it grows significantly. So if you want to have a number at this point, we're probably at a 2 or 3. It will grow in the next 3, 5 years to a 6 or 7. And it is probably going to increase moving forward to much higher numbers. So that's the short answer.
So 2 to 3 is your answer for now?
Right now.
Okay, thank you. Moritz Schularick,
Same question.
Same question?
So I'm a macroeconomist. Everything is always relative to expectations. And relative to expectations, I think it's still underestimated. I think our expectations are maybe a 3 or 4 right now. And we should, as Mikko said, maybe, who knows, maybe in a year or 2 years or 3 years, talk about a 6 or 7. I think we're still sleepwalking to some extent. And yeah, I think if that's the scenario we're looking at for, you know, under policy changes or not, that also will play a role. But I think currently that would be the range we're in.
Okay, a 3 to 4 from Moritz Schularick. And Wolfgang Niedermark, what's your score?
Of course, I would agree to my predecessors here. If I listen to some of our people in various sectors, I'm already at 6 or so, 7, because they have a long-term view. And we have been observing it for quite some time already, 5 years at least. So it's building up and up. And perhaps then I would go for a 6 and leave room for Franziska to even get a higher score.
Perfect timing, I have to say. Welcome to our panel. I've already introduced you, so everyone who was not already familiar with your face knows who you are. And you just joined us for the very first introductory question, which is supposed to be given a short answer to. And I've asked your colleagues here already on the panel, on a scale from 1 to 10, how big is the threat that China's overcapacity currently poses for the industrial base in Germany? And 1 is no threat at all, 10 is a massive threat. And I can tell you that we had a 2 to 3, a 3 to 4, a 6, and now we are all wondering what comes next.
I was going to say 6. And it depends a bit, of course, on the sector. And excuse me for being a bit late. I was, victim of Deutsche Bahn. So I had seriously, I think so much of this feeling that Germany is just not a functioning country any longer is related to Deutsche Bahn. Going to Düsseldorf yesterday, instead of arriving at midnight, I arrived at 3 a.m. in the morning. And the train I was supposed to take from Düsseldorf here just never started in Düsseldorf because there was Personalmangel. So, getting here a bit later.
But we are really glad to have you here.
But I'm glad I did, it's like my team had said, why don't you take a plane to Düsseldorf? It's going to be so much easier. And I was like, no, come on, this I can really do by train. They said, no, look, we told you. So 6, because really I think they're very different sectors, but in some sectors it's really tough. In others it's less. It can be an opportunity. But the number of sectors now we're having difficulties is increasing by the day.
Okay, thank you also for all of you sticking to the brief answer condition. Now, Moritz Schularick, the intro question already implies that there is such a thing as a Chinese overcapacity threat. And I wanted to use the fact that we have an economist sitting here at that table and want to take a few steps back with you. Can you clarify the definitional situation for us? How should we define overcapacities?
That's actually a very good question in the sense that we talk about overcapacities, about subsidies in almost an interchangeable way most of the time. I think what we're talking about is a situation where in that, and we've had this great keynote by Wei this morning, in this mixed economy with a lot of government intervention on various levels, industrial sectors, industrial companies, partly state-owned, but also on the private side from time to time, operate under rules and in a field where the same budget constraints that apply to Western companies don't apply. So they have advantages that can relate to scale advantages in production given by subsidies for capital investment. This can be land subsidies, can be outright tax credits, can be all kinds of things that we're actually debating now as well in Germany, like we think about tax credits, or in the US. But the idea is very much the same, that somehow there are players that are not paying the market price for key inputs, and hence can offer their products in the West or in Europe, in the US, cheaper than in a level playing field, fair competition would be possible. So overcapacity and subsidy, I think it's basically an interchangeable way of saying there is a way of where political strategies lead to a situation where government, state money allows the build-up of very large capacities at a price that is inferior. I think overall, if this is a better business model, economies of scale that have that just get realized, we would have to think differently. Then overcapacity means just they're better competitors because they produce more and people want to buy it more. What we're concerned about is the part where there's some advantage that others don't have.
Mm-hmm. You already talk about concern. Temporary overcapacity is a normal part of market cycles, but when does it become an internal problem or even a threat that affects other economies?
Well, what I just said is exactly that point. If you have a situation where these fluctuations in inventories, the fluctuations in capacity, become a structural feature of an economy, where relative to domestic demand, and I mean it's good you point this out, because German producers are accused of the same thing from time to time with our large external surpluses. But where you're in a situation where your domestic market doesn't have the absorption capacity for everything you produce, I think that's normal. That means you export. But the key difference is really that the level of government support that goes into production facilities and production capacity leads to a status where you have to export at below market cost.
Mm-hmm. Franziska, Brantner, would you say this is also the pain point where China's overcapacities has become a problem for the European Union, or is there something different or additional to that?
No, I totally agree. It's not being good at exports. I'm like, we're doing this. We're trying to get even better. Everybody's trying to do this. So this is not the problem. It is, as you said, when you already have an overproduction in terms of the needs or the export markets, and then you go even further and invest even more. So it's not just that you hold it, but you go even further, and you make it temporarily even cheaper, so that they can get market shares forever, because they destroy and drive out others. And then in the end, they can use the market that they have gained, not because they're much more competitive, but because they have had unfair prices, and then the competitors are out. And I think that's what we see, and that is sort of what is unfair, because afterwards the prices go up. I mean, you can look at this in the raw material sector. It's very evident. They lower the prices manifestly in one sector until all the Western companies are bankrupt, and then the prices go up again. And this is sort of when you say that, it's not because they're so much more competitive in terms of the technology they use, but because they have this advantage of playing the price game. And the second one, which I think also is of importance to Germany and the EU, is that other markets are closing their markets. We're always talking about the US, but look at, for example, Chile. They put a 25% tariff on Chinese steel. You have South Africa, you have India. So you have a lot of other countries in the world which are normally export markets for China, closing slowly down or making it more difficult to access. So there is a concentration of then, the European market being the open one, which is adding, which you cannot blame the Chinese for that. It's not their fault. Or in terms of, it's because others are reacting and we are not yet reacting or shouldn't react. You can discuss that, but at least it also is a secondary impact, I think, for our companies.
Wolfgang, Niedermark, if I recall correctly, you have warned after the US announcement of tariff hikes in May that you need to take care that the internal market does not become a buffer for China's overcapacity thwarted on the US market, which is more or less what you also mentioned with regards to other markets now. And you demanded the EU to use its toolbox. So could you tell us how satisfied are you with what is currently happening with regards to the European toolbox?
Yeah, first of all, I've been heavily criticized for this word of buffer. There's obviously no buffer. I don't know what. I would like to generalize the discussion a little bit and not only discuss the details of the current case. Yes, we have been warning that there might be effects on us due to the situation you just explained. By the way, I'm always amazed how simple the Chinese answer to the question is, what is an overcapacity? They simply tell us, well, we are reacting to your high demand. And that's market economy. And yeah, we have been warning for long that this is a structural problem, as you just described it. We discussed it, I have been discussing it for years, 15, 18 years even. We had discussions on the market economy status where we said, yes, there are many reasons why we don't see a market economy evolving in China. Every couple of years we have a new sector where we observe similar developments. We have seen that in steel and in solar, and now it's upcoming is machinery. We have the automotive case, which might be, and that is relating to your question, perhaps not the best case to dig deep in each and every detail. But yes, we stick to our opinion that in general we have to develop the tools, the instruments. We have done that. There is an anti-subsidy instrument now. And if there are reasons to check and do some investigations, we should do. And if the finding is, yes, there are some market distortions, then let's enter into negotiations about appropriate measures. And yeah, what's happening now that finally, in a very late stage already, we start a kind of dialogue which China was somehow refusing to enter in. But we are now at this stage. So from our point of view, it's also it's only a very consequent and consistent way how Europe behaves for the time being.
Sounds pretty satisfied at the moment, to summarize.
Not pretty satisfied, no, because I would say the time and the way and the announcement and the consultation with some affected industries, that could have all been better. Yeah, but I want to generalize, and then we cannot say, well, that's the wrong thing to do.
Okay, thank you. Mikko, we have already heard that the Chinese response is always, we are reacting to your high demand, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more how this discussion on overcapacity looks like in China. We have already heard also that there have been many cases. There's not only this EV case. I mean, if we go back to the past, steel and other topics that you have discussed already in the past. Could you kind of elaborate a little bit more on the Chinese perspective on this discussion?
I don't think there's a Chinese perspective on this, right? I mean, there's at least, I think we need to distinguish 3 or 4 different narratives. Official narrative is indeed currently, this is another trap by the West, and it's an unfair, almost colonial accusation that can simply not be made, and it is a hostile act to talk about overcapacities. So the recording of this session will already be seen by some Chinese officials as a problem, and the fact that we discuss it is almost a crime. But there's a different, I think, also internal conversation on overcapacities, which is very rational, and senior Chinese economists obviously recognize that there's a problem. So that's the reason why at the Central Economic Work Conference in December, or at the National People's Congress, even in official Chinese statements, there is a recognition that overcapacities is something that we have to tackle. Now, not specifically on the EV or the new green technologies. And then there's maybe a third camp, and that's, you know, more liberal-minded Chinese economists who have a full-fledged understanding of the fact that this is a clash of economic systems and that there needs to be also adjustment on the Chinese side to somehow, you know, at least lessen the pressure on this topic. So in a way, I think there is the problem that we have an official narrative that is very hard to dismantle or work with. It's good to see the negotiations now. But then this leads, I think, to the immediate need to be as fact-based and specific and precise as possible. And then you can look at Chinese statistics. The capacity utilization rate for industrial goods is at the lowest rate of the past 8 years, below 73% at the moment. So that's a hard indicator that the Chinese official statistics provide us with. Now, that's just one indicator. You probably will have to look at inventories, at sales numbers, at export prices and all of that. And then you get to a differentiated picture where maybe the EV case is not even the best case for an overcapacity problem defined traditionally. But there's a problem. And then we have to talk about that problem. So we also need to avoid a rhetorical trap where we basically say, okay, this is an overcapacity story and the Chinese have good arguments to tell us maybe not because the inventory is extremely low. So let's look at this in a very fact-based way. I think what's very clear is we have moved from a phase where this was almost exclusively in the space of heavy industries, steel, glass, cement, etc., related to the property sector and the investment boom in China in the past 2 decades almost. And now it's moving into a different story that is much more broad-based manufacturing because the Chinese industrial policy overdrive is actually doubling down on investment in these sectors. The banks get instructions to invest more in manufacturing, despite the fact that the demand in China is actually relatively low and we have a structural growth slowdown. So that's the problem where I think we will be hitting the 6, 7, 8 relatively soon, but we are probably at this moment not yet there. And then there's a different story, and that's emerging green tech, batteries, solar, etc. Not really emerging anymore, but in a way, they have a relatively solid point there that there is a global demand for these technologies. So we are well advised to be specific about the problem for each industrial sector, as has been discussed previously.
You already talked about the fact that there is different opinions in China. Thank you for raising that point. And I would maybe like to go on the level of the society also and ask you, one reason for the imbalance between domestic demand and supply in China is the government's policy of favoring high tech and over fiscal support for household consumption. So how much support has this anti-welfarism, as you could call it, this approach also within the society in China when reading through the newspapers or maybe talking to people? What is your feeling about that?
Well, that's a big question, and I think it's hard to link it immediately to the story about overcapacities. And I don't think that an ordinary citizen would problematize heavy investment in manufacturing because of the crisis of uncertainty that widespread parts of the society actually feel at the moment. They're more concerned with the immediate job outlook and obviously their property if they have some, or what's happening with their sons and kids, children going to the university or not. So this crisis of uncertainty, I don't think leads to a wave of dissatisfaction with China's industrial policy. At least I'm not aware of it. So this is probably more of an elite debate at the moment.
Thanks. Franziska Brantner, Minister Robert Habeck, he just came back from Beijing and went straight to the Day of German Industry on Monday. And he said there that competitors such as China, he also mentioned others, but he also mentioned China, have been in a boot camp for the past 2 years, while Germany has been struggling with energy supply problems. And as we are already also talking about our industrial base in the West, I was wondering if you could tell us if you have already developed a fitness plan for Germany, and if so, how does it look like?
The fitness plan on the energy sector, we have been doing the fitness plan of speeding up the procedures and all of this. I'm like, this is, you can say it's still not up to Chinese speed because we still give some rights to German citizens to oppose projects, which I think is also okay because in the end, you know, we are a democracy, but we have much sped up the procedures in the energy sector. That's one area, not just LNG. We always talk about LNG, but we have done actually the same on renewable, on now we're doing it on hydrogen, Beschleunigungsgesetz, yeah, I hate these words. Wasserstoffbeschleunigungsgesetz. You can win every Scrabble game with that. Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz is another one. So the speeding up law bill. So in that sense, I think that part of that is a fitness game. And we're trying to do now this dynamization package. And we have been working, of course, on the carbon contracts for differences, which I think are also major in terms of helping in that transition. Because we have in the steel sector, for example, it's not just brown steel that the Chinese are exporting. You know, it's not just the old technologies. It's really in the new area, and I think that is where we need the fitness check. And if I allow me to say maybe a more general question is, we have a joint objective on these new technologies with China. It's climate protection. I mean, like, we have all interest that we have cheap, highly qualitative, good products going to the rest of the world and to our markets as well. And like, we have that joint interest. It's not that we want little production at high cost with bad technology. This is really not our interest. So how do we achieve this joint goal in times of one being a non-market actor and the other being a market actor, one being a democracy and the other not being a democracy? And I think that is a real challenge. And I wouldn't say that all the Western countries together, we have found the one solution. I think everybody's testing, but the US is going one way. We do it much more differentiated. Even if you take the EU answer now, it's so much more differentiated. It goes by company. You know, they talk to the companies. It's much more diversified. So we're looking for ways of how not to give up the joint objective and at the same time keeping our systems open. I'm like, we don't want to become a non-market economy. We want to remain a market economy. And then it's hard. How do you then out-compete those who have all the time the state support? And I think we have been talking now a lot about the imports, but we also have difficulties at access to the Chinese market, which is also an increasing concern of our industry. In the medical sector, that's certainly the case. We talk about it much less, that the Commission is investigating there as well. And China still has not acceded to the WTO procurement agreement. They have promised it, I don't know how many times, but from the very beginning of WTO accession, they said we will sign this and ratify this. And I think now we could justify that there's reciprocity. I'm like, the markets you close up, we close up too. I'm like, you know, getting into a different discussion there. And there are other areas where they also have this non-market approach, norms and standardization. You know that this is, dear to my heart because we see the race there in the new technologies. In Germany, in the EU, in Western countries, this is companies organized together with scientists, and we do help a bit. In China, the norming organizations are state funded. We don't even count this into any of these calculations. This is never ever counted, but it's just one more area where we have to think about, so how do we compete on norms and standards if one actor makes this with state funding and the other with private money? And I can give you another 10 examples on data, etc. Every time you have this question, how do you deal with the difference of a non-market actor and a market actor?
Before I open it up to the floor for the first round of questions, because I'm worried that you also have to leave a little bit earlier. Yeah.
It's because of Abstimmung im Bundestag.
Okay, so before I open it up to the floor, one brief remark on what Franziska
I just wanted
just
to
said.
pick up on what Franziska just said, because there's a really tough question here. No? The tough question is, when do we say, thank you, dear Chinese taxpayer, we take the cheap products, and make our energy transition faster and cheaper than we could do it ourselves? And when do we say stop? This is a threat to our interests in a way that, and I don't think we have the right tools and scoreboards or whatever to make that judgment. I think if you think about Japan and the US in the 1980s, there was also a little bit of hysteria that the US would fall behind. And in the end, I think the US decision was pretty much, let's take these subsidies, cheap Japanese cars, see what we can learn from them and benefit our consumer. And I guess that turned out to be quite the right decision. So I think it really makes sense, and it's important to look at what we're talking, what sectors we're talking about. Some where we think this is a growth engine in the future, this is important. I don't know, battery storage technology, you could probably argue this is something where we don't want to be. This is not an old industry. This is new. This has lots of legs to go and to grow. But maybe solar panels, you know, we're just like, fine. Like, you want to do more overcapacity? Please do it. We take these panels. It's not a problem. So, and also this, because it's a dependency and issue that's much less relevant in some areas than in others. But let's not forget this point. I mean, they're giving us something cheaper than we would otherwise buy it. And so, you know, when you get something cheap, you also have an incentive to take it.
Thanks. So, how do we gonna do this with the questions? So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We have colleagues who will walk around here with the microphones, if I'm not mistaken. Please briefly introduce yourself and also tell us who should answer your question. And I just remind you that in the second block we have for questions, Franziska Brantner won't be here anymore. So use the opportunity, and don't forget that every question ends with a question mark. We have one here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Jürgen Mattes from the German Economic Institute. I have one remark, two brief questions. The remark is we should be clearer, like we have pretty much consensus here, but if we had some other players or some other government representatives, we would hear maybe different views. And we should be clear, what we do with the European Commission is no protectionism. China does protectionism because they subsidize, we try to equalize it. This is no protectionism. We should have a clear narrative on that, and this is not clear. We're basically falling into the trap by repeating what the Chinese say to us. And I think this is, on a meta level, very important as a framing for the whole debate. The question is, how could an outcome of the negotiation could look like? And the second question is, if your forecasts, which I would share about in 3 to 5 years, we might be going to 7, 8, maybe, comes true on this scale of 1 to 10. What do we do? Do we have the capacities? The European Commission had 25 people examining this case. Do we put up another 1,000 people there to do all the things that we have to do? Or, I mean, is our toolbox sufficiently equipped with all the procedures that we have to follow if we want to adhere to WTO law?
Thank you. Another question? Okay, so maybe we start with this first one while you're thinking. Is there any specific person you want to have your question answered by? Otherwise, I would give it to Franziska Brantner also. What do you think? You can also start, okay. How will the negotiations look like? But I would also like to hear from your perspective how they might look like.
First of all, yes, I would agree. The framing is important, but it's difficult. If you talk about tariffs, it's so easy to do another framing and take these. We have to be aware. It's difficult. We have been involved in these discussions for long. The framing is an issue. My least problem is, by the way, the capacity of the European Commission. We have some people there who could do even more investigations. The thing is, and I would like to come back to this fitness program idea. Interesting enough, our industries tell us the best fitness center for us to improve our technological competitiveness is to be part of the Chinese market. That's our fitness center. We talk about technologies. It's not just capacities. while you are scaling up in China, you have huge developments going on which are not happening here. We hear from some really well-known, prominent, huge corporations that they send their engineers to China to learn what is the technology state of the art of certain products. So it's really not a good idea to have solutions which lead to a certain kind of decoupling. That's not the solution, and you know that we always make a very clear distinction between decoupling and some measures which keeps us still in the market, but leverage a little bit other tools like we observe now. And so that makes it really, really difficult to come to a simple answer to your question. Yeah? But of course we are well aware of what's going on in various sectors, and you mentioned some.
What is your take on the negotiations? And maybe you can also say some words. Can we continue this procedure that we have seen with the investigation on EVs in the future?
I think you're right in terms of the framing. In Germany, for the longest time, it was framed as a Strafzölle, so punishing tariffs, and not what the anti-subsidies tariffs, which is a difference. But yeah, the normal citizens, it's hard to explain the difference. But I agree that we should be precise in our language. Yeah, normal journalists, yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's just, we can say it every time in an interview. I say it correctly, and the headline is Brantner in favor of Strafzoll. I'm like, oh no, but, it's precisely not what I said. But this is, I think, because it has been framed like this for so many years now. My worry also is not the people capacity at the European Commission. But I agree in terms of when you ask the question, if we are the WTO, you see the US is not really respecting it, China is not really respecting it. We are still respecting it every single detail. And I think we have an interest in doing so because we heavily depend on WTO rules. But I think we should insist on reciprocity, that if actors are not respecting them, that this really makes a difference to us as well. And secondly, to create new frameworks with partners for the new technologies. I was, while you were in China, I was in the US with, in negotiations or discussions with the still current Biden, some who might be in the next Biden if he wins, and also some of the Trump people. And there's an interest on setting up new trade agreements which are focused on the new technologies, standardization, non-tariff burdens, tariff burdens where they exist, and to make this a larger format where we can say we need to include the Chileans because they have the same problem. Like, we will not be able to do with this problem by ourselves. We will have to find joint solutions, and that might be also a good offer to our partners in the Global South to say, we will not deal with it just as Europeans so that we get away well. We see that this is a challenge to you as well. Why don't we find joint answers? So I think, yes, we should make it a distinct every time exercise to go and do the work. And even if it takes 25 people, we are precise. But at the same time, we need to work on new formats. Last point on the fitness centers, because you asked what might be the outcome of the negotiations. I'm not going to go into details now, but the fitness centers, of course, this is what some of the Chinese, because you were speaking, Mikko, as well, that there's a difference among the Chinese. Some of them tell us, why are you not doing it the Chinese way? We always forced you to do a joint venture when you wanted to sell to the Chinese market so that we could get the technology. So we know that we are in technology in advance. As you said, it's a fitness center for our companies. So why do you not force us to do a joint venture in Germany? So this is also some Chinese, they say, this worked very well for us. And we don't understand why you're responding by tariffs and, doing all of this. Why do you not just do it our way and go for joint venture requirements with a trickle-down effect on technology? And I think in some areas, certainly, they have an advantage, as you said. It's not that we're, and it's good. I'm like, good for them, good for the climate, good for digitalization. Really, I don't blame them. As long as it's a fair competition and if we can benefit more from it, I'm open for it. So this is not part of negotiations, but some of the spirit that some of them also is their response is not just you're totally outright wrong, but not understanding why we react in this way and don't do it in a smarter way, maybe, if I may say so. There's also lots of debates, but I think sometimes we should also open up. And one final thing, for example, we have the challenge with Temu and Shane. And we had a German company doing exactly the same way to the Chinese market, like around 10 years ago. Made lots of money in China, really lots of money, undercutting all the Chinese companies, until the Chinese state reacted and say, okay, this is not going to work. So putting on platform requirements, customs duties, So in a way, they also tell us now, why don't you do it our way? And sometimes I think it would be so much more acceptable if we just said, we do it. But that's, of course, not necessarily WTO way.
And if I just one quick follow-up question before you probably need to leave on the outcome of the negotiation. Will Germany be in favor of tariffs in the end if Chinese don't really make concessions, but just give you these ideas of why don't you do it our way?
I think now it's the time for the Commission and the Chinese to negotiate, and I think any interference now from member states would be harmful and not useful. And I think that is really what we have to understand, that if we are not playing it as a European member state together, we will lose out anyhow. And in that respect, I think any saying now, if it's not like this, then it comes, is not helpful, because that reduces the leeway in the negotiation space for the Commission. And I think now the Commission needs all support they can have from all member states to have the strongest position to negotiate.
Thank you. Mikko, maybe directed to you, also the question when it comes to the negotiation. Is it an illusion that the EU can change China's industrial policy in these negotiations in any way?
If you ask for a yes or no, clearly it's an illusion. But there can be minor adjustments that would lead to minor adjustments on our side. I think that's what we are looking at, most likely. But the European Union standing up and basically changing how China's internal economic policy works is absolutely out of the reality. So it's also not the goal. That's a good point. I think so. In a way, again, the language, these are tariffs that are meant to adjust between a huge difference in economic systems. And I think that's maybe the key point here again, and also related to the question of capacity. I'm not that confident as the two colleagues here on this panel about capacity to manage this on our side. I mean, there's the question of can you handle an emerging trade war that goes much beyond what we currently see. Those people who have done the 700-page report in the European Commission to look at the market distortions, we know how hard they work, and that's hardly sufficient to prove in a legally sound, rule-by-law way what's happening in China. We know from many China researchers here in the room how difficult it is to access information. I think quite a few things will have to change in terms of ramping up capacity to understand what's happening in China. But also, I would argue, are we really prepared for this new period and phase of globalization where a more proactive shaping of this environment will be required that goes beyond the current institutions? To me, it seems pretty clear that if things continue to be on this clash trajectory, which they are, that we walk into a world where we look at beyond WTO. And that needs to be shaped, conceptualized, implemented diplomatically, and all of that. So in a way, I would think we need much more capacity on foreign economic policy more broadly in Germany, in particular, to think about how we can manage that in a productive way. Thank you.
Is there any chance of having more capacity in the future?
I don't think it's a question of capacity of we have enough people, but the question is, are they ready to shift their mind and think in new ways and adjust to new times? And I think that is a challenge. I don't need to add 200 people to the Commission. I think, if everyone there makes this now we have to, as you just said, find new ways. What next to the WTO, what do we do if we have a next Biden administration and says, okay, now let's make a global, sustainable, resilient supply chain agreement, and let's make it with many partners in the South, which will require capacity. So do we go there instead of maybe doing the zillionth round in the WTO? So this will be rather a question. And I think this is sometimes in a prioritization. And I think there I agree with you. Is everybody ready to make that shift and say, okay, we don't give up on it. We remain a rule of law. We remain a market economy. We remain a democracy, and we adjust our tools. But we don't give up on this, because that's what makes us. And I think that is the challenge, rather than adding people.
Thank you. We have one more question here in the fourth row. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Philip Mironit from DJP, German Council on Foreign Relations. My question is a bit following up on what has been already mentioned by many of you. Thank you very much also for the good panel. I think there is a bit of, a lot of talk about this being viewed with the basically lens of trade, overcapacities. There's also a view which could go through security or economic security to some extent. And how far do we need to have those discussions, and where do we stand already here? And what is your view, and this is really to everyone, because I'm really interested, on where are we in these discussions as to how we classify certain things as just trade-based, for example, as the solar panels, for example, or is there more of a security angle to it? Thank you.
Maybe Moritz, Schularick, how far are these discussions on economic security?
Yeah, let's say thank you, Franziska, and for
thank you for joining us.
Maybe. So very good. So let's continue.
Thank you.
Let's hope Parliament is late too, not just Deutsche Bahn. So yeah, I think it's a very important aspect of what we're discussing is the question of economic security for Europe and how it's linked to some of these very clear strategies by the Chinese to be a very strong actor in certain sectors. And I think we're talking about things like pharmaceuticals or the supply chain for pharmaceuticals. We're definitely talking about the critical raw materials and their processing. So I think what's been happening with the EVs in some ways is just, it's one part, and it's one where we have very strong commercial interest in Germany because of the car industry. But it's just like one piece of the whole puzzle. And I think that you could go through the supply chain of EVs and you find that Chinese companies dominate up to 80% of the entire supply chain. And you want to, at each of these points, you could say, how dependent do we want to be? So we've woken up from this old world of, you kind of call it naive globalization, and we're asking these questions now. How much leverage do we want to give to other economic actors in terms of dominating that? And it can be, look, I mean, my favorite question in policy meetings is where, people wake up for a second, is what actually are we prepared to do, talking of economic security dependencies, if China decides to support Russia much more than it currently does in the war in Ukraine? What are the tools? How, have we done the checklist, what we can, afford and are willing to do at what cost? And the answer very often is no. So I think this is part of why we're here. We need that intellectual infrastructure to think these questions through.
Intellectual infrastructure, but also, Wolfgang, Niedermark, when you talk to your members in the industry, how much is security an issue? How much is economic security a topic that is thought about?
Yeah, it's a topic, and that's a big difference to what you just said about Japan and the challenges we had in the 80s and 90s. There, it was just an economic issue. And I'm really grateful that you opened the view and put your question on the table in how far security issues are affected. And we are deeply involved in this discussion, and we force our members to do that and not shy away. I would admit there are some people in business who it's more convenient to shy away and just stick to. By the way, also our Chinese visitors always tell us, oh, you are the BDI, don't talk about security and politics, it's not your business, stick to yeah, that's the normal beginning of a conversation at our tables in our premises. And we refuse, and I have to say I was really proud to see how well it was staged by Robert Habeck this time in Beijing, where he did this very clear connection between the two spheres and addressed the Russia support issue in a very good and clear way, without aggressiveness, without being too impolite, but just speaking out clearly what is our view, and that there is a problem, and if this problem is even increasing, that we run into a situation where we have to act accordingly. So he did it in a very appropriate way for someone who has been for the first time in China. Oh wow, I said, well done, well prepared. And so we joined forces here, and it's an inconvenient topic, but we have to deal with it, and we do that.
Franziska, Brantner, in Japan, they even have a minister for economic security. Are we sufficiently equipped on a government level to tackle these issues? Do we also need a minister for economic security?
We are certainly not yet having enough the interconnections between the economic and security communities. I think it started for the last couple of years, but we don't have the same level of joint understanding and analysis as we have in countries like Japan. They are really years ahead. We have had now this economic security analysis of the European Commission in some fields like quantum, AI, biotech, semiconductors. And you could just also tell in the Commission, you know, you have the DG, which is technically responsible for these areas, and then you have those working on the security side. And we have the same on the national level in our ministries. You have the Interior Ministry, the BSE, you know, our institutions, and then you have those who are working really on the industry side. And it's an exercise to bring these communities together. They often don't have the same language. Not the same backgrounds, and then to come to joint solutions, it's not yet so easy. But I think we're getting there, but it would be too much to say we are already there. I think we're getting there. If this needs a ministry, you know, I think there's so many horizontal issues these days. So instead of creating another 10 ministries, which will not make it better, we have to get better in governments to work across ministries. And I think this is a real challenge to our current democracies, is that we are remaining in these silos while the world is flying across. And we have been trying to do this with these state secretary committees now that we have across the ministries. And I think that's not the worst way, because creating for every horizontal issue a ministry makes no sense. But you really have to make sure you get the diversity in a room to do joint analysis and decision making. And that's not the usual mindset how our democratic ministries, or even in the plenary, in the Bundestag, you have the committees. It's the same. Huh? You have to. It's very separated. And I think in a way we are ahead on the ministerial side compared to the parliamentarian side, where you still stick to your committees, which are very separate. I have not had a joint session this term on the economic committee together with the defense committee on economic security. You know, I'm like, it's not my job. I'm not going to criticize the parliament, but we have now many sessions between the Ministry of Defense and ours on economic security. So at every level, I think we have to get this horizontal approach much more into people's normal daily life.
Mm-hmm. So thinking not only in silos, but also beyond. Mikko, in Germany's China strategy, de-risking is kind of the buzzword. And talking to many Chinese interlocutors is also the pain point that is always raised in every discussion. Why do we see China as a risk? At least that's my experience when I talk to Chinese interlocutors, and it might be yours too. However, China is also de-risking, and I was wondering if we now talk about our thinking of economic security, is there something, as we have rather recently started this debate, that we could even learn from China when it comes to de-risking, even if they don't use the term?
Look, I think there's a lot that we should try to understand better in terms of how China manages its economy and global interdependencies. I definitely think, as the Chinese would also say, all of this needs to be adjusted to our circumstances. So I don't think there's a copy and paste for Chinese industrial policy that works in any way. But an element of, being pretty aware of its own vulnerabilities, for instance, having a solid understanding of how industrial value chains actually function, and what parts of this can and should be controlled for them to have a long-term vision for their own industrial base. I think that these are issues that we should take very seriously. But then again, China is not the only country that does this, right? It's particularly difficult for Germany, I think, to adjust our mindset around this idea of a new phase of globalization where not everything just works based on what companies do in terms of their immediate internal incentive systems. So there's something to learn there, but at the same time, I mean, we are already in a competition of industrial policies that will lead to a race of subsidies and all of that, and a huge new set of challenges that we'll have to manage. So I would be also quite, careful with the copying.
Moritz, Schularick, because we have heard it several times now that China's methods to some extent also don't differ so much, and that we ourselves don't always, or the US and other players, not comply with all of the rules that we have given ourselves internationally. Franziska Brantner has mentioned that before. To what extent would you say that China's methods differ? Because we were also reminded that we should stick to the facts and maybe raise the European flag that our measures currently are not protectionism. So to what extent do China's methods differ from, maybe also if you look back in the past, policy of other economic rising powers such as the US or even Germany in the beginning of, before the 20th century?
Before I come to that, and it's a great question, I just wanted to say on the economic security angle, I think, coming from, like in finance, we have an institution called stress tests for banks. So we run every year, every 2 years, we run these scenarios on our financial system in order to find out what would happen, what if that happens, what if that happens. And I think the sort of very clear parallel here would be we have to run stress tests on our dependencies, would say what would happen to our supply with antibiotics, what would happen to, we should have done it with the energy earlier, I guess, we've learned that lesson, but I think the first step would be to establish these stress tests and just go through as well as we can. We'll get better. We have a lot of firm level data, we have a lot of micro data now in international trade that we can use for that, and then say, okay, here are the weaknesses, these are the fields that we need to address if we want to have that room for maneuver in negotiations and in international economic affairs. And then figure out in the next step, what are the policies to address those weaknesses? And it can be, in some cases, that can be, let me say the word, it can be industrial policy of our own in some cases. In other cases, it can be other intervention. It can be equalization tariffs. It can be diversification. There are all kinds of ways to deal with that. But I think this would be sort of the logical step of events that we need to take, and I know Franziska and many people are looking into that, and I think that's something where these cross-cutting perspectives are very needed.
What I thought was interesting about the stress testing that we started with the Commission on these 4 sectors, for example, on quantum, one of the main challenges identified is shortage of expertise. It's not anything external, is we don't have enough experts to work on this to expand and make it bigger. And this is also part of the answer then, to say, well, you do stress testing, you're actually quite strong, but what is the limits to becoming better? Because what you see your competitors are doing, and the answer is, universities need to invest more there, and companies and states to build up this expertise. So the answer, as you said, I think is very correct, is sometimes really not you put a tariff, but you train more people on quantum. And I think that is the good approach by the Commission as well, to go through every single sector. Sometimes it's difficult because the Commission doesn't have a competence. The health sector, it was debated during Corona, you all remember. But I think it really makes sense to make these stress tests at the European level. We should do them also nationally, but in the end, if it happens in France, not in Germany, I'm not so much worried. We just need to make sure the markets are open and interconnected. So this is, I think, the right level to do the stress testing. And we do now what we call deep dives. So they will go into some of the sectors to do the deep dives.
Thank you for sharing that. And if I may...
Very short comment, yeah.
I also have a question for you, maybe first, and then please add your comment. Because what Franziska Brantner just says kind of reminds me also of the famous BDI paper from 2019 on China, where it there is one chapter on strengthening our own competitiveness, and it's saying without investing in our infrastructure, improving our education system, and promoting research and development in future industries, we have little chance of competing with a China that does just that. Now, that's 5 years ago, and I was wondering if you could also tell us what has happened in those past 5 years from your point of view, from the point of view of from the industry.
Okay, first a short comment on stress testing. That is, of course, good to do. It's not enough. After the stress test, the findings have to be translated into some measures, if necessary. We have had stress tests, rare earth 2016, or when was it? And then the stress test was over. We were all shocked and said, oh, we have to do something. But then the stress level was lowered again, and then we all fell asleep again. And the question is whether we really learn from this experience and have a strategic approach. And then the question is whether we really rely only on corporate decisions or whether we incentivize. And that's what we perhaps can learn from China, that they work hand in hand. It's a problematic thing. We believe deeply into entrepreneurial decisions and room for maneuver, and it's not so pleasant for us to think about a world where we always have to align with the authorities. But if the authorities would come up with some measures to incentivize, measures which can be jointly seen as a strategic good step, then we should do so. So that was a short comment, sorry. The long one, on the longer question is, yes, our paper was first 3 elements. First, China there is a fundamental difference between our systems. We have been believing that there is a kind of convergence. It will not happen. China is different. It will stay different. It will change. It will not change to our systems. There will be no open markets. So that how we react. Second thing is we have to do our homework in Brussels with all kind of instruments we need. That is partly done. And the third thing is we should work on our own competitiveness. By the way, that was the biggest part of the paper. Yeah, do your homework, get fit, and work on energy policy, work on education, work on technology, and you have the full list. And that is really the basic thing. By the way, the main theme of our Tag der Deutschen Industrie the last 2 days, we are focusing, we don't want to complain only about a strong China, which is not playing to the rules. First step to be competitive is to be stronger and better and work harder yourself. And there we think there are still some deficits. We are a bit complacent, and there we should start finally. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to a topic that you, Franziska, Brantner, have mentioned a couple of times, namely the Global South and other emerging markets and how they react to the current situation. This morning I read that the Mexican ambassador to China has said that trade barriers need an expiration date and should not isolate China forever. So in the past 2 years, at least from our analysis at Körber Stiftung, and I think many people would agree because there's many initiatives on that, Germany has kind of tried to do an outreach to many countries in the Global South. Is there also an ongoing discussion on these issues? Do you try to explain why the European Union is taking these measures? What do you hear from partners in those countries?
If you may, just one sentence on the education, because we often do not talk about in these China contexts, but for example, the 20 billion Startchancenprogramm, the education program just to get the basic skills, reading, writing, math, for 10 years, I think is exactly a reaction to that, to say, okay, we cannot afford in Germany, year 2024, that we have so many people quitting school without being able to read and to write and to do a basic math. And I think that is, sort of the fitness, the basic fitness, where we have to go even further. To the question, I'm always insisting on not just making this a European issue, but that we as Germans and as Europeans really have an interest in being in contact and reaching out, being in trade with many countries across the world who have faced the same questions. When we say we are dependent on processed raw materials from China, the Chilean are dependent on the Chinese taking their raw materials and transforming them so that they come to Europe. I'm like, they have the same dependencies, and they would like to have more diversity as well. And I think if we overlook these opportunities to engage and make joint projects, then we really miss out a lot. Then it's not about protecting, then it's really about protectionism in a very basic national way. You know, I always say to the Americans, because in a way everybody believes they're in America first. I'm like, even if you talk to the Democrats, none of them will say America second. Huh? So I think the difference that you now have between the Biden and the Trump people is not America first, but is it America first and single, or is it America first with others? And I think that is where we also have to make sure it is always with others. And what have we done? I'm like, you know, we have been engaging, reaching out. Robert Habeck didn't just go to China, he went to South Korea. You know, we do a lot of this, reaching out to new governments, traveling, taking companies with us. We have facilitated a lot of the external funding instruments, made them easier, debureaucratized them, made it financially more attractive. So we do a lot to get partners, new partners. In a way, they're not always new, huh? And like some of these are very old partners, older than China in terms of very intense economic relations, but re-engaging. And I'm very happy to see that many in the industry, not all, but actually quite a number of them are also following up and doing new projects there. And also actually being quite excited about new markets opening up. And sometimes, of course, the difference is that the market is never as big as the Chinese. So you know, if you compare on size, you will never have the same equivalence. But I think that this is an important pathway, as you said, you know, not to just do it in a European way.
To just come back to one aspect of my question shortly, and then I want to hand it over to Mikko also to give a comment. What is the feedback that you get from those countries? Is it enough to reach out? Are they currently worried because they are worried of an escalation of a trade war, which is bad for everyone?
The Mexicans, certainly. I'm like, what you see, of course, is that the Chinese have invested now heavily in Mexico and export from there to the US market. And if that is a joint venture and you employ Mexican people and then it goes to the US, that's not a problem. But when you hear the Trump people, then that becomes a problem for them. And the new president of Mexico, for example, is much more differentiated. She also wants no Chinese factory only with Chinese employees, which you have quite a number of them in Mexico. So this is a debate within Mexico. It's their debate, but it will be impacted by who will be the next president in the US. So you have these debates in all of these countries, and they're not unrelated to how we debate it. And when we go there as Germans, we're very welcomed. I'm like, the door is open. We have to go through.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mikko, and maybe you can also, at the end of your comment to this topic, include your view and take your crystal ball, because currently the EU investigation is on overcapacity, focusing on EVs. But what are other sectors that we should watch in China? And maybe you can give us this little outlook as we are nearing the end of this discussion.
Happy to, although I don't have a crystal ball, but I think something that is underestimated currently is that this issue is not just a challenge for advanced economies. So indeed, you know, Turkey, Brazil, other places are responding to the specific EV investigation. But if you look at China's industrial policy plans and most recent announcements, it is very clear that the leadership wants to construct a catch-all economy that basically does not give away the low-tech manufacturing to other places. And that basically means for a long time, other emerging markets, developing economies will have very little chances to basically catch up in terms of export growth globally. So this story, I think, will be much bigger moving forward. And in a way, it's also a function of China's industrial policy. And I think we need to look at it a bit more closely and not just look at our own effectiveness. In terms of crystal ball, I think, you know, one of the issues that we will certainly be facing, whether we want it or not, because it will happen, driven by Washington, is the issue of legacy chips. semiconductor manufacturing is a big topic. I think we definitely have a return of the old heavy industry story in terms of steel, etc. All of that will also be part of our response pattern. And then probably underestimated at the moment is the broader electric machinery story, not just in terms of what will happen for European imports, but also third market competition.
Thanks. Moritz, Schularick, I also want you to ask to look into your crystal ball and give you a quote from the Chinese Prime Minister Li Qiang, who recently warned developed countries that reducing China's role as center for global supply chains, and I quote, would drag countries into a vicious cycle of scrambling for a cake that becomes smaller and smaller. Should we be very much worried that this is going to happen?
I mean, I think there's a lot of rhetoric in that sentence, but I think there's a more basic point, which is we have an interest also in engaging China and keeping China in our trade relations, and it's also a way to, make sure that China has a stake in continuing peaceful relations with the rest. So I think the decoupling scenario, like we as economists, we tend to believe that trade is good for peace because it raises the opportunity cost of conflict, and you're much less likely to get into trouble. Obviously, that it's much more complicated than that, and we think a little bit more detailed about this now. But I think we shouldn't forget that there is a joint agenda, and if you think about climate, especially, I think it's clear to everyone that we'll need both the Chinese manufacturing capacity. That's like to some extent a good overcapacity to have if you want to transition the global climate, and also we need to engage them on a lot of global public goods. This being said, I hope this is like this EV thing. It's really the first time, and Mikko has been in. Maybe that's not true, but to me it's the first time that with the EV subsidy tariffs, equalization tariffs, like this whole economic security. How do we strategically do trade policy as Europeans, as Germans, has come to the forefront. I guess because it's about the car industry, and Germany loves the cars and car industry, but I hope it's the first. I mean, there's so many other themes, like the development cooperation, what's happening in Africa. I mean, Christoph and his co-authors have done this amazing work at the Kiel-Institute about Chinese lending and how that interacts with our development goals. So there's a whole agenda of topics where we have to think about how do we react and act strategically vis-a-vis a country of the size of, an economy of the size of China that not only touches our economic interests but also our security interests. So I hope this is not just a one-day fly, but a more broad, is the beginning of a more broader conversation about our interests and how we position ourselves.
And last words to Wolfgang Niedermark. Maybe you could also tell us if the German industry is looking in its crystal ball, because to stick to this analogy, because we currently see a new wave of policy-driven capacity expansion in China, and not all effects might be visible yet. So does the industry look in a crystal ball and gets prepared, or?
Yeah, sure. We are monitoring the situation permanently, and my bet is similar to yours. The next one is machinery, which is also seen as a backbone of our economy. And yes, that's what we are doing, not every day, but constantly. And we are well aware. And then I think it's very important to endorse your statement that there are many other questions of high importance in this whole setup, and I was grateful that you mentioned the security issue. And my concern, and German industry concerns, is that this will be the biggest challenge of all, and there is no sustainability without security, so we have to really focus on that. And who has not done it? You can also see the last panel of our last industrial session was only on security, and was really impressive what companies told us about their perception on this issue. So we are well aware that this challenge is coming up, and we are ready to at least think about it.
Thank you also for giving us some homework to do. Well, we have We are running out of time. It's already 2 minutes later, and I don't want to keep you longer in this very warm room. I just want to say thank you. I've learned a lot. I've learned that that on our scale we are somewhere between 2 and 6. That's quite a range, and also that we should use the current very hotly debated issue of the EV to make this topic not a one-day fly. So thank you very much for joining with your insights, with your time here at this panel. Thank you to the audience to stay with us. I know it was very warm. I hope, nevertheless, you've also taken some insights from this panel. Thank you to the organizers for putting this together. And with this, I wish you a very nice evening and a fruitful second conference day tomorrow. Thank you.
So let me also extend my thanks to the panelists and also to Mikko and MERICS for organizing this together. And of course also to Julia Ganter for hosting this great discussion. So I'm also looking forward to our second day, which we will kick off with a keynote speech by Nancy Chan on the geoeconomics of the 21st century. So this, I'm 100% sure this will be very exciting, so look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning. So to the speakers who joined for the speakers dinner, we will meet at 6:30 downstairs, ground floor, and walk together to the speaker dinner. And yeah, if either see you later or see you tomorrow, and have a nice evening. Thanks.